Amen. Good morning.
Good morning.
Wow. Wonderful. I invite Reverend Sherry Kendi to come forward. And I offer on behalf of the leadership of Metropolitan Community Churches congratulations to the members of SunCoast Cathedral Metropolitan Community Church on the occasion of your 20th anniversary. We bless you for the faithfulness of the first members to have a vision and commitment, current members who have invested in the mission to demonstrate God's unconditional love, 20 years of openness to all people without boundaries for gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, or any other feature that makes each person uniquely and wonderfully made, your witness to radical inclusivity that is at the heart of our ministry as Metropolitan Community Churches. We bless you on your journey this day. It is wonderful to be here. Happy, happy anniversary. My mom's visiting, Barbara. We've been here often enough that she feels right at home, so that's great. You know, this week she gave me an article about how pastors in Bradenton, Catholic and Protestant, kind of complaining and said something like, I hate Lent, because Lent is often kind of somber, and I said, I guess they've never been to Lent at MCC, I guess. We can't help but we know the end of the story. I know that my Redeemer lives. And having your anniversary in the middle of Lent is a wonderful celebration that the whole story is ours at every moment. And what a story it is. A powerful redemption. What a witness you have been. I thank God for you and your faithfulness, not only in this location, in your community, the many ways in which you have touched and blessed lives, the ways in which you have saved lives, but also the way in which you are such a wonderful part of our denomination. Your members have offered leadership in the top levels of our denomination, have offered their gifts in preaching and teaching and giving. They're offered, your pastor and many other of your members have helped create the kinds of leadership training opportunities available for all over our denomination. I thank you for that. Also, there are 15 members of your church who, in addition to tithing to this church, give over and above as members of the Moderator Circle. And that's a group of about 350, 375 or so people around MCC who give to help that gap between what it is that churches provide in their assessments and what we really need to be able to do the work. Members of the Moderator Circle give between $150,000 and $200,000 a year to help out. You're in the top 3 of churches and numbers of members of the Moderator Circle in your church. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart for that commitment and just for the joy of being with you today. And to see you are the persevering church in every way. And I thank God for you. Will you pray with me? God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. Well, our readings today are about the cross. Very interesting to think about preaching about the cross on a happy anniversary Sunday. So pray for me as in many ways we together understand the meaning of the cross for today. Mark's Gospel was written probably in about the 60s, early 60s AD. It's the earliest Gospel that was written, and among the earliest writings in that early church. Like you, the church for which the Gospel of Mark was written was about 25 years old or so. So when we think about the Gospels, we shouldn't think not only about the early setting and that original conversation with the disciples, but we should also really be thinking about Jesus' message through Mark to that early church. because it was that early church that was really under siege in so many ways. They were experiencing that first wave of persecution. They were struggling, they were challenged, they were growing and becoming more diverse and trying to cope with what that meant. Jesus, in the middle of that, gives them a message for perseverance, isn't it? Take up your cross and follow me. Now, none of us in this church, in this place, are likely to have to take up the cross in our lives. And so, how do we understand the meaning of take up your cross and follow me in our lives today? Some of you may be familiar with the name Father Malcolm Boyd. Malcolm died on Friday at the age of 91. He was a dear friend of mine for about 40 years. I first read his book, Are You Running With Me, Jesus?, when I was 15 years old. Malcolm at that time was not out as a gay man. He was in the closet. And when you read Are You Running With Me, Jesus?, you can feel some of the struggle as he talks about everything from sexual freedom to contemporary issues at the time, racism, things that are still very contemporary. And he was a person who was a hero of the civil rights movement, who was a freedom rider, someone who all his life continued to reinvent himself, and a very dear friend. As a way of being in solidarity with him this week, as I knew that he was dying, I began looking through the prayers of Are You Running With Me, Jesus? And if you haven't read them in a while, some say that he was the Shakespeare of contemporary prayer. And so, but interestingly, as I flipped to the back, the very last prayer, the topic is the way of the cross. And so I felt like it was Malcolm's gift to me today. And I sort of want to start my sermon with the punchline. So you'll know what the sermon is about when you hear this. His prayer begins, teach us the path, show us the way. They say that everyone has a cross to bear, Jesus. And you once said, take up your cross and follow me. What do these things mean? I think they mean that every person ultimately has to face up to reality, to face one's own calling, destiny, nature, and responsibilities. In your own life, Jesus, you faced reality directly and unequivocally. You incarnated the truth as you believed it. You didn't pander to any easy or obvious popularity. You attacked the hypocrisies of the human power structure head on. You rejected the status quo in favor of obedience to the realm of God. And when it came to taking the consequences, you didn't shy away, even from torture or execution. The way of the cross was your understanding of your mission and faithfulness to it. The way of the cross seems to be, for every individual, the reality that dictates style of life, defines mission, and brings every person into communion with you. Help me bear my cross on the way of the cross, Jesus. So I'm going to take my cue from him this morning and say, I only have 2 points in this sermon. So there's 2. Number 1 is that the way of the cross is that way of facing our calling. You know, MCC was probably founded around the same time that the musical The Man of La Mancha was on Broadway. And I know that because in the earliest MCC recordings of worship, they are singing To Dream the Impossible. It was big on Broadway, and that worked for MCC Los Angeles, I guess. And so they sang that powerful song, the song of this idealistic belief that the things that seem totally impossible to us are possible with God. And there's that one wonderful line from Dream the Impossible Dream that says, we are called to march into hell for a heavenly cross. I've always thought of that line from Man of La Mancha as something of the description of the ministry of MCC from our earliest days. We were called to march into hell for a heavenly cause, to risk foolishly, as Paul speaks about, the foolishness of God that is wiser than human beings. And for some people, that hell is a personal one, of addiction, of guilt or shame or loneliness or suicide, or in some way feeling unworthy of God's love. For others, that hell is structural. It is about issues like racism and sexism, homophobia, about poverty in our world. One of my great heroes was Archbishop Oscar Romero from El Salvador, who 40 or 50 years ago spoke up for his own people in El Salvador, who were being ruled by a very brutal regime at the time. And he talked about structural poverty and that hell of poverty that people lived in his own country. And he said, you know, what is it that when I give shoes to children who have no shoes, people think I'm a saint? But when I ask the question, why do so many children not have shoes, they call me a communist, he said. He said, when they kill me, and they very well may, I will rise again in the Salvadorian people. And just in this last month, Pope Francis, you know, the Vatican was no friend of Archbishop Romero's for most of his life and time, and in the time since his death. But in the last month, the Pope has begun a process of recognizing him as a martyr of the Catholic Church and as someone who may be considered for sainthood along the way. And I'm so touched by that and the healing that that will bring in El Salvador to so many people. He marched into hell for a heavenly cause. Malcolm Boyd, in 1964, having become an Episcopal priest, he was a Broadway producer. He was someone who did stand-up and lots of other things in Hollywood. Then he became an Episcopal priest, and he ended up being a freedom rider in the South in the early 60s, during the early days of the Civil Rights Movement. And he spent one summer, 1964, in Mississippi, and was part of this Freedom Center in a house in which people lived. They were registering voters and really working for change. And he talked about what it was like in the middle of the night to be on guard duty from midnight to 3 a.m. and what it was like to sit and listen to every dog bark, to the sound of every car coming by, and to think about what it meant foolishly to risk his own life. I think of those young people risking their lives, some of whom lost their lives that summer and the summer afterwards, for the cause of human dignity, for voting rights, to be in solidarity with people who were still not completely allowed to be citizens in our own country. 30 years later, Malcolm Boyd and I, who had become friends by that time, were arrested together at the Board of Supervisors in Los Angeles, California, because they were hoarding hundreds of thousands of dollars, probably even close to more than $1 million in funds for HIV/AIDS, to distribute very important needed drugs. As Malcolm and I watched our own friends get sick and die, clergy in LA area, LGBT clergy, we went to the Board of Supervisors and we knelt in front of their right in public and disrupted their meeting, and we were all arrested. And Malcolm had done this many times in his life. I'd done it a few times by that time. And so we were processed, we were in jail for a while, got out. But the thing that bothered Malcolm the most was that in the LA Times the next day, it said, "People dressed as clergy were arrested this morning in front of the Board of Supervisors." He wrote the longest, angriest letter that ever got published in the LA Times. Even in all his work in the South and civil rights, he'd never been delegitimized as an Episcopal priest the way he was when he came out as a gay man. And think about those days, and the foolishness and the risks we took when it wasn't popular to do that, when most clergy weren't joining with us. I also thought with a lot of conflict in myself around young Kayla Mueller, who died in the hell of Syria very recently. Her resume at age 26 reads like someone in their 50s. Her activism as a human rights activist and humanitarian aid worker precedes even her college years. She'd been in some of the most dangerous places on the face of the earth as a peacemaker, a person of enormous passion who could not stand what was happening in Syria. And one day she took a risk with someone from the Spanish Doctors Without Borders and drove to Aleppo on a rescue mission, and on the way back was captured. And eventually, as you know, she was killed in the bombing raid. I think about her. I heard someone on NPR kind of criticize her as, well, at the time she wasn't working under the auspices of a particular aid organization, and that would have provided more safety. And I listened to all that, but felt in my own spirit that Kayla's impact over a long period of time, who can measure that? Who can measure the people she touched, those she inspired? I know she was most grieved about how this impacted her own family and the letters she wrote to them. She was strong. She was somebody who definitely was sacrificial. There's a story, I don't know if it's proven true or not, that someone, perhaps even, I think someone she was very close to, came to the prison she was at saying he was her husband, and that she told them she had no husband because she was afraid for this person's safety, and so sacrificed herself, perhaps, for him. I don't think she was any more foolish than Malcolm Lloyd in 1964, or those young people who went from college to Mississippi and offered themselves for change, or than people who founded MCCs have been all over. The chances we took to march into hell for a heavenly cause. It does make you do foolish things sometimes, and sometimes those have tragic consequences, but I believe that God moves through even those moments of the cross, and even those terrible moments, that God is redeeming. And that's my point number 2. The way of the cross is the way that transforms suffering into hope. I believe that is what the cross of Jesus Christ means to us today. No. So much of the suffering that happens in the world is invisible. It isn't in our consciousness. And I believe the way of the cross is to make visible that invisible suffering. That was true in our community, wasn't it? As we began the long journey that we are still continuing in many places in the world, there are many places where it is still terribly unsafe to be who you are as an LGBT person, or even a person affirming of our rights. And as we have become visible, things have changed. As people have stood up with courage, things like marriage equality, which I don't know about you, but I never thought would happen in my lifetime, or that I might see. In Alabama, no less. So, hey, Georgia's got to be next. What's going to happen in Georgia? We got to have it happen in Georgia. Amen. Some of you know I've been involved in the problem of human trafficking worldwide. Today, there are 27 million slaves in the world, people who are labor trafficked or sex trafficked. 10 years ago, people didn't even know there was such a thing as modern slavery. We've been on a wake-up journey, a wake-up call, uniting against this evil. And there are people who are transforming suffering into hope in this world around this issue. There is so much to do in our world. My favorite story, though, from the Gospels about the cross is really a story from Luke. And it's the story of the thief. I love this story because of the way it is about transforming suffering into hope. In Luke's Gospel alone, the two thieves are not just identified identically as taunting Jesus on the cross. But there's a thief they call the good thief sometimes. Now, he was not a good thief because he was innocent of his crime. In fact, he himself said, "I'm guilty of the crime for which I'm paying the price." But this thief does something interesting. Now, maybe if he's just a thief, he was using one more opportunity to steal something at the last minute before he died, you know? I'm gonna steal heaven even on my way. I don't know anything about his motives, but I know his story has lasted 2,000 years because it's a powerful story. Maybe he was opportunistic, I don't know. Or maybe something just at the last minute as he saw Jesus and he felt something about this person hanging there on that cross, and he decided at the last minute, I'm going to throw my lot in with him. Something about him. Something about how he is bearing up under this suffering. Something about his witness. Something says, I want to be with him. And so he says these wonderful words, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Undeserving? A criminal? All those things. But Jesus, in your mercy. Jesus, in your grace. Jesus, remember me. He goes for it. He grabs onto hope. I love that about this moment. And then the other best thing about this story is Jesus' response, because I believe that the thief's real purpose was to remind Jesus of who Jesus was. And Jesus' worst moment in his life, hanging on a cross, maybe having some moments of feeling like, was this all a joke? Well, am I a failure because I'm hanging here? Did I do enough? Is there any prayer that anything will continue after I'm gone? In that moment of darkness, the thief comes and says to him, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And in that instant, Jesus became king. And with authority, he says to this thief, truly, in the King James, it's verily. I would like that word, verily. Truly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. Now there was a strength and authority and a confidence in that moment that came from the depths of being, came from the heart of God, didn't it? Right through Jesus. Right there, to that thief, to that one person. You know, sometimes you don't think you can save the whole world, but maybe you can save one person. And maybe that makes it seem all worth it in this one moment. Here's one person, our last chance. You know? I think about Jesus being given the gift. You know, sometimes we have to receive a gift that someone reminds us of who we are or whose we are. You know. And the thief gave Jesus. And not only the thief, but Jesus himself, his suffering, was transformed into hope at that moment. Today, what a word of hope. Today, you will be with me in paradise. Powerful. I think about that. MCC, we're about helping people grab hope, aren't we?
Amen.
We're people ourselves, aren't we, who grabbed hope early on and said, Jesus, remember us, your people. And we have to be foolish enough to believe that God can heal and change the world, that God can end shame and slavery, that God can end addiction, that God can heal the wounds of all of our people. As you start your 21st year, SunCoast MCC, what risks are you going to take? How foolish will you be this year? What realities will you face? What will God call you to become? And how can you trust God to to transform all of the suffering that you encounter into hope. Whose suffering will you make visible and help transform this year, in the next 10 years, in the next 20, and beyond? Will you pray with me? God Almighty, use us, bless us, as you help us follow you, help us take up our crosses, as you help us anticipate a glorious and amazing Easter. Thank you for calling us to be your people. Thank you for transforming our suffering into hope. Amen.
Amen.